Okay, Chapter 6, Principles of Pathophysiology. Pathophysiology is the study of the body, the processes of the body, and generally how they relate to disease and the disease processes. So in this lesson we're going to talk about the common illnesses that we might find, or actually we're going to talk about how some common illnesses kind of affect your body. As we hit the different emergencies throughout class, we'll specify on the more detail about those emergencies. So we'll kind of talk about how the body reacts and compensates for a few of these. Again, like anatomy and physiology, this is not something that we can truly get a good grip on in just an hour or two of studying it, but it gets us a basic exposure. Of course, we have our objectives. Our objectives are found on page 135, 136 of your text. A couple of multimedias that you can look at in the regular PowerPoint. It talks about the cell structure and then the transport of carbon dioxide. And our major concepts that we want to look at here are cell and cellular metabolism and the results of alteration of cellular metabolism, the respiratory system and the importance of oxygenation and ventilation, and the cardiovascular system and the movement of blood throughout the body. Additionally, we'll be looking at perfusion, hypoperfusion, and shock, and then the disruption of physiology of major body systems. So we start out with the cell. So, like I mentioned, pathophysiology is the study of the disease process, and having kind of a basic understanding of this will help us get a better grip on what the patients are going through. So the structure of the cell. Plant and animal cells are relatively similar in structure. However, each different organism has different cells, and in fact, we have some highly specialized cells in our body. The reproductive cells of the human body are extremely specialized for exactly what they do. The largest single cell you find in the human organism is an egg, an ovum that has been matured and discharged from the ovaries, and interestingly enough, the smallest cell of the human organism is the mature sperm. So the sperm from the male, of course, millions and millions and millions of those go rushing towards one single egg, and it's a matter of who gets in first. So the structure of the cell, the standard, typical idea of a cell for the human body, and most animals have a variety of different structures that you may find in there. Ones that we'll spend a little bit of time looking at is probably a review from high school biology class, but the nucleus being kind of a big blue structure kind of in the middle of the cell there, and the nucleus is really the control center. Within it there is the nucleolus, and that's where a lot of the DNA is found, or a genetic blueprint. We have the endoplasmic reticulum, which you'll see as a kind of purple ribbon-like structures in there. And the endoplasmic reticulum synthesizes proteins, and it actually creates a lot of the energy, actually synthesizes proteins and does some of the transport. The mitochondria, on the other hand, is the one that creates a significant amount of the energy by using glucose and oxygen to create adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. We have a cell membrane around the outside that kind of protects it. It allows certain things to come in and keeps certain things out of it. Some of the cells may have cilia or even a flagella on it. We have a lot of ciliated cells in our respiratory tract that will help to clean the respiratory tract out. The one cell that we commonly think of in the human that has a flagella, which is a big long tail, of course, would be the sperm. There's the cytoplasm, or the cytosol, which is kind of the jello that holds the whole thing together. If you think about fruit cocktail and that's been mixed with jello, and if you want to think about all the little pieces of fruit being the organelles, and the cytosol would be then the jello. There's some other objects in here, centrioles, which are used for cell division. There's the Golgi apparatus, which do some transport, lysosomes, which will actually are kind of a self-defense mechanism, secretory vesicles, which remove other things from the cell. So the cell requires water, and the water, the glucose, and the oxygen are used in, number one, maintaining normal body functions, and then of course glucose and oxygen get together and they make ATP in the mitochondria, and that is the fuel for the cell to function. And without that ATP, most of the specialized structures won't function within the body. If the body would become dehydrated, then things don't work well. Things don't just flow around like they're supposed to. With that too little water, things start to wilt just like your plants would, and the body just doesn't fire right. Too much water, the cell systems don't work. They're flooded, and the chemicals are all off balance. So water obviously is huge, affecting the level of our electrolytes. The major electrolytes being a lot of the salts that we eat. So when we talk about sodium and potassium, those being major salts that are used in our body on a regular basis, magnesium, calcium, chloride, amongst several others, are the big electrolytes that we use. The salts, particularly sodium chloride and potassium chloride, have very close attachments to water. So if you've ever noticed that you've eaten a huge salty meal and you felt a little bloated and puffy afterwards, that's the reason why. You had all this excessive amount of salt in your body. Your kidneys said, well, we have all this salt, we need to have enough water to balance it out, so your kidneys retained the water. They didn't let it go. Eventually, the body starts to sort it back out. You will dump the sodium or the potassium, and the water will follow suit. So try to think about the cell metabolism as a refinery and how it turns crude oil into gasoline for use in our automobiles. Very similar process. So oxygen in the cell. Oxygen is required for the cell, obviously, to work at maximum capacity or maximum efficiency. And when the oxygen is in the cell being used with the other structures, the other substances, then we have aerobic metabolism going on. So if you were lucky enough to be alive in the 80s, like some of us were, you'll remember the aerobics craze. And aerobic metabolism was pumping it up, getting oxygen flowing through your body, so the body can use energy efficiently. It's actually about 16 times more efficient to do aerobic metabolism than it is anaerobic. Anaerobic metabolism is when we don't have oxygen. There's a lot more waste of energy. There's a lot more waste product that is created, and then the body will become acidic, and it impairs a lot of the body functions. So it's kind of like putting bad gas in your car. It just doesn't fire right. So just kind of a real quick look at how this whole system works. The cell takes in glucose. Interestingly enough, just to aside on this, That cell cannot take in glucose without a hormone to help it get in, and that hormone being insulin. And then once that hormone, insulin, allows glucose into the cell, it becomes a catalyst for its use. So glucose gets into the cell, finds its way with the presence of oxygen to the mitochondria. That mitochondria then creates a whole bunch of energy in the form of ATP. Whereas with anaerobic metabolism, glucose can still get used. It's used much less efficiently, and a lot more pyruvic acid, which then turns into lactic acid, is created. We've all heard of lactic acid before. Lactic acid is really the problem that we deal with after working out. We get kind of some stiff, sore muscles, and a lot of that has to do with lactic acid buildup. But the more you work out, the less you have to deal with that because your body is much more efficient in doing it. So cell membranes, membranes are semi-permeable in general, and a semi-permeable membrane allows certain things to come through and certain things it will not. Like I said, you have to have insulin in order to get sugar across that membrane, so it's selectively permeable. It says, yeah, we'll take sugar, provided that sugar brings insulin along with. It negatively impacts the membrane's ability to transfer certain fluids, electrolytes, and other substances in and out. So sometimes the cell gets overflowing with stuff, or sometimes the cell actually shrinks down because too much stuff has been lost too quickly. However, sometimes the cell membrane will allow certain toxins to get into the cell as well. So it's not a perfect guard, but it does a pretty decent job. If you go to the regular PowerPoint, you can watch the cell structure video. So let's talk a little bit more cardiopulmonary. Cardiopulmonary is what we refer to the cardiac system, cardiovascular system, and the respiratory system combined. And they are responsible for bringing the oxygen into the body, moving that oxygen to the cells, and then removing those waste products. And they sometimes have to work with other systems, so certain waste products have to be disposed of by the kidneys or the liver, and then any breakdown in the system can result in a major failure. We can have a lot of issues. So if the lungs aren't functioning well, then it's not efficient. The primary function of the cardiopulmonary system is to deliver that goods and take away the bads. But if we put a blockage in a vessel, or we put water in the lungs, or we put a band around the heart, it really messes things up. So the respiratory system begins with the airway, and that airway is technically starting at the nares, the external openings of the nose, and the mouth, and that's the beginning of the external parts of the airway. And that's where it allows not only just air, but food, water, and so on and so forth to make its way down to the epiglottis. Remember I said the epiglottis was the flap that kind of keeps the bad stuff out of the respiratory system. You can see the hyoid bone actually on the top of this picture. I mentioned the hyoid bone in anatomy and physiology as being the only bone in the human body that doesn't articulate with any other bone, and it's the anchor for the tongue. And it's kind of the junction between the tongue and the larynx. Larynx is your voice box. Around the larynx you'll have thyroid cartilage, or I'm sorry, thyroid gland. Parts of the larynx include a cricoid cartilage, a thyroid cartilage. There's a membrane in there as well. Those are at the top of the trachea. The trachea is a semi-rigid structure, and we're actually looking at this from the front. If we look at the back of this, the back side of the trachea, it does not have the rings that we see on this side. It is C-shaped rings around the trachea, and the back side is actually soft, where it kind of basically shares a wall with the esophagus. So the shared border with the esophagus is not rigid. That ringed structure then goes down to a point called the carinas, where it splits into the left and right mainstem bronchi, which will then split to secondary bronchi, into tertiary bronchi, into terminal or into bronchioles, and finally terminal bronchioles. And that's the routes that the gases take in and out of the functional component of the respiratory system. That functional component being the alveoli. So here we are at the alveoli, and you can look and see that we have the terminal bronchiole there, or what they refer to as a respiratory bronchiole. But the terminal bronchiole has the smallest little passageways into these grape-like looking structures called the alveoli, and those are the air sacs. To look at the air sacs a little closer, there's some elastic bands around them, as well as some capillaries that will, number one, allow them to kind of stretch out a little bit and allow us to inhale and exhale. And then the capillaries are where the actual business of gas exchange really takes place. In order for the airway to be functional, we have to have an open, or what is referred to as a patent airway. And that patent airway allows free airflow back and forth. Sometimes we have airway obstructions, such as foreign bodies. You ate too big of a piece of steak. You were laughing and messing around and choked on something. Infections such as croup or epiglottitis can cause some obstruction. And probably the biggest one is trauma. We have trauma that will occasionally destroy our airways. So getting hit in the throat, maybe with a ball bat. So the lungs are the lower part of the airway, and the lungs is the functional aspect of this. We have a couple of terms that we use along with the lungs, number one being tidal volume, and that also will lead to minute volume. But tidal volume is the volume of air moving in and out during each breath. So on the inhalation, exhalation, how much air moves in and out. That's usually somewhere around the 700 to 1,000 cc's of air in a typical breath. You'll get a couple hundred cc's of air which actually end up in the dead space, so that they don't even make it to the lungs. They're stuck in the trachea. But we take that tidal volume and we multiply that by the amount of time we breathe in a minute, which is typically around 12 to 16, and that equals our minute volume. So if we say 700 or 600 times 10 per minute, just for the sake of easy math, 700 times 10, that's 7,000. So about 7,000 cc's in a minute's time, or 7 liters is what that equates to. The lungs will respond negatively to certain types of obstructions, such as water or fluids, and any change in that in the tidal volume or respiratory rate changes will reduce the minute volume. So if we put, let's say, a band around somebody's chest that they can't inhale more than 500 cc's of air at a time, that will greatly reduce their minute volume. They go from 10 a minute times 500, we now go to 5 liters instead of 7 liters. So, and respiratory dysfunction occurs at any time in which something interferes with that minute volume. So maybe the rate really jumps up there, but the faster you breathe, the less likely you are to have a good tidal volume. So it doesn't take much to disrupt all this. So disrupting that respiratory control, respiration is controlled in the brain or the brainstem by what's a structure called the medulla oblongata. If you've watched The Waterboy, you probably know the joke that goes along with that. But any event impacting the function of the medulla oblongata can affect a minute volume. And a lot of things actually will affect this. So infections such as meningitis, drugs such as heroin or morphine, certain toxins will affect it. Trauma when the brain starts to swell, there's only one way for it to escape, and that's out of the big hole in the bottom of the skull called the foramen magnum. And one of the first things that goes out that is the brainstem, of which the medulla oblongata is a part of. So when we have this disruption, it really can have a huge effect. So disruption of pressure in the pleural space. The thorax, or the chest, is composed of the ribs and the muscles between the ribs. And then there's a thin layer on the inside of this called a pleura, and it's actually referred to as the parietal pleura. And then that same membrane really actually extends around and covers the outside of the lungs, and in which case we then refer to it as the visceral pleura. Well, those two pleura aren't really supposed to be separate. They kind of have a very thin, minute amount of fluid in there that keeps them basically stuck together. And then if we break a hole in that wall, we can have what's referred to as a pneumothorax. And when we then spread the two pleura out, we then get a collapsed lung. So a pneumothorax is the medical term for a collapsed lung. And in the cases of which air has filled the space where the lung should be. Occasionally we also get blood filling that space, and in that case it's a hemothorax. But if we deflate a lung, it cannot fully function at its fullest capacity. It has to be re-expanded, and that's not something we can easily do. So sometimes we have to create some positive pressure to push air in. Depending on how the hole happened in the lung, whether somebody got shot, we could have something called a sucking chest wound, and air is going to escape out the chest wall, or maybe it's just all something completely internal. So either way, we've got air leakage, and the lung is not working off of the typical vacuum system it's used to. Trauma or medical problems can compromise the ability of the alveoli to exchange gases. There's a condition called congestive heart failure. Congestive heart failure is a condition in which there's too much water, there's too much pressure in the circulatory system, and some of that water leaks into the lungs. And when this happens, that water actually gets a lot of times between the alveoli and the capillary, and it spreads them out, makes it harder for air to get through. And then sometimes even that congestive heart failure leads to water leaking into the alveoli, and when the alveoli are full of water, it's harder for air to just easily jump across. So we get a lot less O2 in and a lot less CO2 out, and that can lead us to low oxygen levels in our body, which is called hypoxia. And at the same time, we will also see hypercapnia, which is high levels of carbon dioxide. So respiratory compensation, this is when the respiratory system is affected by a challenge. Chemoreceptors in the brain and vascular system register low oxygen levels, and carbon dioxide levels are rising. So the body attempts to compensate for changes. When we say compensation, what we're doing is we're trying to make things better by somebody working harder or somebody doing something differently. There are chemoreceptors in your brain that detect the level of carbon dioxide in your body. That is your primary stimulus to breathe. It's called the hypoxic drive. It's called the hypercapnic drive. The hypercapnic drive is our main drive for the respiratory system. So when your level of CO2 gets high, your body says that's enough, get it out, breathe. People who have been lifelong smokers will develop a condition called, not always, but will often develop a condition called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, which is usually emphysema and chronic bronchitis together. And those people, once you've developed COPD, you have switched your system that you typically rely on. Most people rely on high levels of CO2. Well, people who have smoked for years have always had high levels of CO2, and so their body changed the mechanism that it uses. And so it stopped using the primary system, the hypercapnic system, and it now relies on the hypoxic system, or the hypoxic drive. So the backup system, the hypoxic drive, means when the body senses a low oxygen level, that is the stimulus to breathe, as opposed to the more efficient system of detecting high levels of CO2. So that brain stimulates the respiratory system to increase the rate and or tidal volume. You breathe a little faster, you breathe a little heavier, you move a lot more air in and out, and you can balance things back out. All right, in the cardiopulmonary system, we have the blood. And the blood, of course, from the last chapter, we have plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Plasma is the liquid. Red blood cells is the workers that does all the carrying and transport. White blood cells does all the fighting of infection, and then platelets makes the clots. Plasma itself, it has a certain oncotic pressure. So we're going to talk about some chemistry and physics here. But oncotic pressure is a thickness, a viscosity, that helps it maintain certain pressures so it doesn't leak out and go into other places. We have hydrostatic pressure as well, and the heartbeat is creating a pressure inside the vessels, otherwise known as the blood pressure. And this pushes the fluid back out of the blood vessels and toward the cells. So with that is the process of how a lot of this chemical process occurs. So when these two pressures are working together, we have a nicely regulated blood pressure. The cells are hydrated well. If we throw one off, where we change the consistency of the plasma, or we change the blood pressure, it's harder on the cells. It's harder on the body to work efficiently. So some blood dysfunctions that we occasionally might deal with. The most common blood dysfunction is related to volume, so bleeding or dehydration. The less blood we have hypovolemia. That's the term for low blood. We have less ability to exchange gas. So if we're supposed to have 6 liters of blood in our body floating around, and we now have 4 liters of blood in our body floating around, 4 liters still have to do the same job that 6 liters did, and it usually can't keep up. There's fewer red blood cells in that smaller amount of fluid, so therefore there's less gas exchange, and there are fewer water-retaining proteins, so there's less volume. The proteins, like I mentioned, that are found in plasma help direct water. So sometimes these things are going to occur from bleeding or from vomiting, from diarrhea. Sometimes it'll actually be an issue of the blood itself, such as something called an anemia, where there's small amounts of red blood cells. So just a brief reminder then on what the capillary or the vascular system looks like. Arteries carry blood away, veins carry blood back. Veins are less muscular but have valves. Arteries are very muscular and high pressure. So blood's path from the heart, it travels through the arteries, reaching the smallest arteries called arterioles. Those arterioles feed the oxygenated blood into those tiny vessels called capillaries. It's where all the work happens. The good stuff is offloaded, the bad stuff is unloaded, and away it goes through the venules, back to the veins, and then back to either the kidneys or the heart, liver, where it needs to go to. So they take the good, they distribute it, they pick up the bad, and they bring it back, and they get rid of it. So blood vessels obviously have to have an adequate pressure to make this cycle work. This pressure is controlled by changing the diameter of the blood vessels. So you'll hear about drugs that are called vasodilators, nitroglycerin being one of them. There's an even more famous, probably, vasodilator that works on a very specific part of your body referred to as Viagra. But it causes vasodilation and causes more blood flow. So the stretch receptors within certain parts of your arteries will monitor this pressure and say, yeah, too low, no, too high. Let's make a change. Make a change so we can even things out. So, and then the pressure gets changed all the time by your body. Sometimes when we're not feeling well, we don't deal with, we don't change as easily. We don't adapt as easily. So if you've ever had that situation in which you were laying on the couch for a while, the doorbell rang or the phone rang, and you jumped up off the couch, and all of a sudden you were like, ooh, I'm a little lightheaded. Your body just didn't react as quickly as it normally does. So it caused you to be temporarily hypoperfused, but usually you come back around rather quickly. So a loss of tone. The vessels lose their ability to constrict and dilate. Usually this occurs because the loss of the messages coming from the nervous system. And the main time this occurs is when you have a spinal cord injury. You have a spinal injury. That spinal injury stops sending signals to the blood vessel to tell what size to be, so they just kind of do their own thing. A lot of times they're just way too big. So you'll see blood pressure starting to drop. Sometimes this also occurs from major infections. So people that have something called sepsis, where their whole body is flooded with infection. Allergic reaction, a major allergic reaction called anaphylaxis also causes this. So basically, we look at these pictures and we think about it for a second. There's the same amount of blood in both pictures. It's just the vessel is twice the size as it should be. So if you have 6 liters of blood in a 12-liter container, you're not going to be efficient. If you have 6 liters of blood in a 6-liter container, you're going to operate as best you can. Other things that happen with blood vessels, sometimes things become extra permeable, particularly capillaries. Capillaries leak fluids out their walls. I like to think about capillaries as the Chinese handcuff or the Chinese finger cuff, where you put your fingers, one finger on each side of this tube. You try to pull your fingers out, and you can't. And it's a pretty tight-knit little mesh. But in order to get your fingers out, you kind of have to push the finger cuff together. And when you do that, it usually opens up some holes on the sides of it. And it's the same thing that happens to a capillary. When we superdilate these capillaries, they become permeable and they start to leak. And so in cases of, say, sepsis or losses of tone, then we would see leakage occur. And that leakage is eventually going to lead us to being hypovolemic, because we've lost the water that we typically need for our blood. Systemic vascular resistance also plays a part in the pressure inside those vessels. So the tighter that the blood vessels are, the higher the blood pressure is going to be, the harder it is for the heart to work. So there's a lot of various conditions that will lead to this, constriction of the vessels. Hypertension is the medical term for high blood pressure. So people who deal with high blood pressure have hypertension. This can be because they have a lot of buildup of plaque inside their vessels. Maybe they just constantly have too much tone in their vessels, that's causing them to have higher blood pressures. And it is a major risk factor in stroke and heart disease. So the more pressure in the vessels, the greater chance something gets broke off or floating downstream or injured or damaged. Additionally, the heart has to work that much harder in order to compensate and to work with that. So the heart, the heart is the pump that contracts and ejects the blood. Usually it ejects somewhere around 50 to 60 to 70 milliliters of blood per contraction, which is roughly a shot glass full of blood each time it pumps. Stroke volume, and stroke volume is the amount of blood that is ejected with each contraction. There's a few things that will influence that. the preload, which is the amount of blood returning to the heart. So if you only have 4 liters of blood in your 6-liter vessel, and we know veins are a low pressure system, it's going to be very difficult for there to be a lot of blood returning to the heart. Contractility, or how hard the heart can squeeze, and that can be influenced by things such as heart failure or heart attack. And then afterload, which is the pressure within the vessels, and that's the systemic vascular resistance. So if you already have high blood pressure, the heart's already weak, it's that much harder for the heart to eject blood out and keep the body functioning. Cardiac output. Cardiac output is the stroke volume times the beats per minute. So if you eject 60 cc's of blood every time your heart beats, and your heart beats, we'll say just for the sake of quick math, 100 times per minute, that equals 6,000 milliliters or cc's of blood in a minute's time. Your cardiac output would then be 6,000 mLs or 6,000 liters. If we slow the heart rate or we decrease the stroke volume, that can reduce our cardiac output. If we have a big change in systemic vascular resistance, that can affect cardiac output. So rapid heart rates often don't allow the heart enough time to refill. So instead of firing 60 cc's at a time, it maybe is only firing 30 cc's at a time because it didn't have enough time to refill. Some heart dysfunctions that we may deal with, physical traumas. Maybe you've been struck in the chest with a ball bat, or shot in the chest, stabbed in the chest, something along those lines. We have squeezing forces, cell death or heart attack. So the squeezing forces would be something, there's a bag around your heart that protects it. If that bag fills up with either infection or blood, you get what's called a pericardial tamponade, and that bag doesn't stretch well. So if you fill it up with blood or something, it constricts the heart but doesn't allow the bag to continue to stretch out. The heart attack. With the heart attack, cells die. Myocardial infarction is the medical term for heart attack, meaning myo, muscle, cardia is heart, and infarct is death. So the death of the heart. We can have electrical problems as well. Sometimes that SA node or that AV node or even the Purkinje fibers get a little rammy, and they throw things into overdrive. And when they throw things into overdrive, they cause the heart to not function at full capacity. The VQ match or the VQ mismatch, this is the entire cardiopulmonary system working together, and we've got to maintain a good balance between ventilation and perfusion. I think I mentioned before, if you can have the heartbeat at optimal capacity, but if you don't have the lungs there to keep it ventilated well and keep the respiration going, it's of no value, and vice versa. So any breakdown in the system impacts the body significantly, putting into a life-threatening situation. The biggest thing that we see in the ventilatory perfusion mismatch is something called a pulmonary embolus. And when a pulmonary embolus is you developed a blood clot in a lung, the air is going in and out of there, but the blood can't pick up that new good air because it's blocked. And then we have shock. This is perfusion is the regular delivery of oxygen and nutrients and removal of waste, and shock is the hypoperfusion state. So when we can't function at full capacity, we have this breakdown going on, and this can result in the death of our patient. So when does the body try to compensate? Well, the body senses these problems going on and says, well, I'm not working well. How am I going to fix this? Or what am I going to do to make things better? And it can do a couple of things. It can increase the rate of whatever system's not working well, whether it's the heart rate, which will make circulation better, or increase the respiratory rate, which will get rid of more carbon dioxide and keep more oxygen, or increase the oxygen amount in the body. We'll also see some dilated pupils because that's a side effect of the sympathetic nervous system, as well as pale, cool, and clammy skin. The clamminess comes from the adrenaline rush, and the pale, cool skin comes from the body saying, hey, I don't have enough blood to keep the skin circulated well. I'm going to shut off the skin and move my blood into the center of the body where I need it. It's called shunting.